Welcome, everybody, on behalf of SID-Washington. Super excited to have this day together. My name is Sarah Helmstetter, and I am a board member, and I have the pleasure of introducing this session on private sector engagement in development, and our moderator, Stan Veuger, who is a resident scholar at American Enterprise Institute. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Can everyone hear me? All right, welcome to our session on private sector engagement. In the spirit of engagement, feel free to not leave here without introducing yourself to everyone at your table. We have done that as well over here. I'm excited to introduce our panelists today. As you just saw one Sarah, we have two more Sarahs here, and a Tara. Directly to my left is Sarah Glass, who is the acting director of the Center for Transformational Partnerships at USAID. Then Tara Hogan Charles is Associate Director of Global Government Relations and Public Policy at Procter & Gamble. And then Sarah Thorn is Senior Director of Global Government Affairs at Walmart. We're going to talk about private sector engagement. I hope we'll have at least some time for questions from the audience as well. So start thinking about questions you would like to ask. But first I want to start with Sarah Glass. Because obviously, you know, who is going to engage with the private sector on this topic? It is, among other stakeholders, the public sector, in this case, USAID. Sarah, I know last year you guys rolled out a new private sector engagement strategy. The administrator came to AEI to talk about it. We had a conversation. Can you talk to us about what the goals are of your agency's private sector engagement strategy? How are you going to measure those goals? What's the process from here on out? You know, why can't you guys do this yourselves?
Why can't we? So I think that all of us who work in international development have come to a recognition that we can't, just with our philanthropic or aid funds, buy the results that we need. The problems that we are facing, the challenges and the opportunities that we are facing in global development are too large for the size of any one organization's resources. And Administrator Green, the lead of USAID, has really focused on this concept of supporting our partner countries on the journey to self-reliance, with the idea that we should be working ourselves out of a job in the global development industry. We should be helping our partner countries be able to plan, support, and fund the development that they need on their own. And we know that one of the most important ways that that happens is that private sector investment occurs in the countries in which we work, and that creates sustainable jobs and industry and tax revenues and an opportunity for citizens who have not had opportunities in these countries previously. And that's both global investment, so foreign direct investment, as well as the rise of local investment from micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. So as we have really focused at USAID on how do we increase our focus on supporting our partner countries in achieving self-reliance, one of the most important components is this component of private sector engagement. And so Stan said that we had published a policy earlier this year on private sector engagement. It really is a mandate for all of our staff and all of our partners to work in a new way across all the sectors in which USAID works. And that policy asks our staff and our partners to ask 5 questions every time we approach a development or a humanitarian challenge. And those questions are, could the market do this themselves, right? And if so, we in the development space should get out of the way and help make that happen. The second question is, could there be a market-based approach to achieving this challenge that would perhaps be more sustainable than a traditional development approach? The third question is, what are the roles and the interests of the private sector in this challenge? And sometimes there is a challenge that there's not a market-based approach to, but the private sector actors who are operating in these communities still have a potential role and strong interest in the set of issues. Either they can bring valuable expertise, or it's something that really affects their business and that they care deeply about participating in. The fourth question is, are there factors that are constraining the private sector from investing in this community? And then, of course, the fifth question is, are there ways that USAID could help alleviate or remove those constraints or barriers to investment? And we're really asking, as I said, all of our staff and all of our partners to strategically address those questions in every development challenge and humanitarian challenge that we face. So that is our new policy and our way of working. It really builds on work that we've been doing at USAID over decades in pockets across the agency where we've had success in working in this way. And it asks our teams and our partners to further institutionalize working in this way and integrating it. I'll stop there, but I think in the discussion, I look forward to talking about, it's been 6 months since we've launched this policy, and so I look forward to talking a little bit about the progress that we're making, working with many of you, actually, and also with our private sector partners. Walmart and Procter & Gamble have been strong partners to USAID for more than a decade now, and have really sort of helped lead the way, I think, in what has become a sea change in not only our development actors thinking about the role of the private sector differently in development, but we really are seeing a shift in how private sector actors are thinking about their role in development. And so I think there is just a really ripe opportunity at this moment for us to increase our collaboration in a way that increases greater scale and sustainability of the development results that we can achieve working hand in hand with our partner countries.
Thank you, Sarah. Let's first go to Walmart. So sure. One of the you just received some praise. Why don't you tell us how you see your company's role, both with respect to USAID's new initiatives and generally in the development space?
Absolutely, and it's great to be here. I actually want to start where Sarah ended because, you know, when we started looking at the development equation, we obviously looked at it from a market-based approach. We're private sector. Why wouldn't you look at a problem and think about a demand-driven solution? If you're training farmers, why wouldn't you go to the market and see what the market wants to buy first? And I have to say, we came into this equation with almost a little bit of, probably too much kind of arrogance, you know, like, why wouldn't you do it this way? Why have you been just training farmers and hoping somebody would buy from them? And it wasn't until somebody said to me, guess what? You weren't there. Like, you weren't helping us. Walmart was not at the table all these years that we've been doing development work. And it really was sort of a wake-up call for us to say, we probably should approach this with a little more humility, with a little bit more understanding of the ecosystem of challenges that the development community has been addressing for years and years, and to try to come at it with a real set of partnership, not just with a donor organization, but across whatever that ecosystem is to solve a challenge. We at Walmart, we're a large company. We have over 2.1 million people who work for us. We're in over 27 markets. We have thousands of suppliers. And so we have some assets to bring to the development equation. We're also the world's largest grocer, which sets us apart in that we can actually work very closely with the base of the pyramid on issues like farmer training and agricultural development. So what we try to think about when we come to a development problem or equation is, what are the assets we bring? What are our needs? You know, as a large grocer, we want to make sure that ecosystem that is supporting our enterprise is sustainable, and making sure that whatever's happening in that supply chain, as we transform our business to an omni-channel retailer, that we're looking out and making sure that we have a sustainable system. And so we approach the development equation in that way. We have been very successful in partnering where we are thinking about those assets and the mutual benefit between what's the goal of the agency, what's the goal of the development practitioner, and what's Walmart's goals. We've done quite a bit of farmer training together where we can be that off-taker. And in fact, what we found when we really did a lot of analysis together and mapping was, it was actually not as good an equation when we brought philanthropy to a farmer project. And I'll say it's mostly because we worry about self-dealing. If we can co-create with you or with USAID and say, what is the market, what are we looking for, what are the geographies where we have people, where we can we can transfer that product sustainably? How do we make sure we're inclusive of gender? And then we can co-create a project where we're the off-taker. It tends to be a more sustainable and successful project than when we go back in with a hypothesis and create what used to be sort of the GDA. I will say we've evolved and are starting to work on bigger, more complex problems like issues of forced labor, where it's not the old system of just a project really doesn't work because the issues are so complex. We have to think of systems change, and we have to think of all the tools in our toolbox to address these really systemic issues, whether it's government relations and communications and patient capital, to do real systems change and looking at gaps. And so we've also evolved to think about partnership as intelligence sharing and information sharing and working together to problem solve is a partnership for us. It's harder for you guys to measure that when you go back to the Hill. But I'll give you an example. We did a work in Southeast Asia with IJM. We were trying to work on this issue of forced labor in the seafood industry. And one of the challenges we saw was we just didn't know what we didn't know. We didn't know how to go attack the problem if we didn't understand where is it most prevalent. So we funded a prevalence study with IJM, and we made those results public, and we did it in partnership with the Thai government. And we were in meetings just last week with USAID where they were saying that prevalence study helped us think about programming and thinking about supply and chain. And so to me, that's a partnership too. And we have to think more broadly about the definition of partnership and not just like my money, your money project.
That's right. So, Tara, I wanted to ask you to talk about that as well. How you think of private sector engagement, especially as it goes beyond, government A makes a loan to company B to do a project.
Thanks, Stan. It's a pleasure being here. Good afternoon, everyone. Usually I'm the biggest company on the stage, so I hate sitting next to Sarah and hate being on a panel at Walmart with their 2.6 million.
You sell a lot to Walmart.
So how many of you are familiar with Procter & Gamble? So raise your hand if you think you've used a P&G product. Wonderful. So if you brush your teeth with Crest, wash your hair with Head & Shoulders or Pantene. So this is where I get you, Sarah. If you, if you put Pampers on your baby's bottom.
They're all on our shelves.
I know they're all on your shelves. Thank God for that. Then you're familiar with P&G. So we are 180 some odd years old. We're in 70 countries. And we touch the lives of about 5 billion consumers. So we've been around for a long time, and we engage in communities around the world. And we come at the development conversation a little bit differently. The way that we think about kind of the doing good, right? We as a company, we talk about being a force for growth and a force for good. It's really integrated into our business. What I'd like to share is that when it comes to development for us, it's not about funding because we don't have a big foundation, we don't have a big fund, but we do have product innovation, we do have great expertise within our company, and my challenge for everyone today is to think more creatively about private sector engagement. So I have to give a shout out to Sarah and their report, Sarah Glass, and the private sector engagement policy report. I read it, not all of it, I will admit.
It's really good bedtime reading.
I know, if you're trying to go to sleep. But I was very engaged. But it's actually very good. I'm very encouraged to see the agency and the work that Administrator Green and how they're thinking about private sector engagement. It's very encouraging because it talks in ways that the business community understands. And I think that enables many more businesses and many more industries to be engaged in these big problems that we're trying to solve. So if you saw my name on the schedule, you knew I was going to talk about our packets. And this is one way that the private sector can contribute to solve some of these problems. And so that's the Global Water Challenge. And about 15 years ago, we used to own the Pure brand, which is a water purification business. And one of our laundry scientists was trying to figure out how do you clean dirty laundry water. And we're so good at cleaning dirty laundry water that we found that it was actually drinkable. We branded the sachet. It's a little 4-gram sachet that can clean 10 liters of dirty drinking water. We tried to sell it. Didn't do it well because of the distribution models. We don't know how to distribute these sachets. We're really good at making products putting it on a truck and putting it on Walmart shelves. That's what we do. So taking a sachet like this and trying to sell it in markets and communities that really need it wasn't our strong suit, and we failed miserably. Instead of shelving the technology or selling it, we decided to leverage the humanitarian components, and we created a nonprofit within our company called the Children's Safe Drinking Water Program. And for the last 15 years, we provided the sachets at cost to implementing partners who do great work with USAID in order to incorporate clean drinking water into their programming. And we've also leveraged it in humanitarian response. So it's pre-positioned with a lot of with many of the emergency response organizations. We sell soap and shampoo, and we sell diapers. We're not an implementing organization. We don't do development. We enable development. We enable the big programs that are trying to solve some of these big problems. So I would encourage you, so I was at the previous session that talks about communication. What's the call to action? My call to action is to think more creatively. Think about the problems that you're trying to solve. The 5 questions that Sarah articulated are the exact same questions, well, not the exact same, but very similar questions that we engage in solving problems within our organizations. There will be challenges as we go on this journey, but I truly believe that the private sector engagement, the NGO community, civil societies, companies, and governments have to work together to solve the big problems that we have as a world.
Thank you, Tara. I think that gave us a pretty good overview of what private sector engagement in this context means. What I would like to turn to next, and maybe Sarah, you can address that first, is what are the success metrics? Like, when do you feel like you've accomplished what you set out to do with your strategy, policy, mandate, whatever your preferred term is? And I'm going to ask you guys too, what's in it for Walmart and Procter & Gamble. But Sarah, do you want to talk about that?
Sure. So that actually is one area of progress for us since we published our private sector engagement policy. Is just last week, USAID published our private sector engagement evidence and learning plan. And I think what I would say about the success metrics is that this is hard and sometimes ambiguous and not as easy as saying the return on investment is X. That's an important component, but it's one component of several components that also include the development result is Y, right? And sometimes these things are not easy to measure and they don't have clear counterfactuals. I think for the last decade or more, as we have talked about metrics for success for private sector engagement in development, we've talked about dollars leveraged from the private sector. And that's been our primary metric. And very often that has resulted in USAID or other donor or civil society organizations showing up to Tara and Sarah and saying, I have this thing I want to do, and can you please write me a check to do this thing, right? And we are missing huge opportunities to find intersection of the objectives of our organizations and more sustainable results when we do that. And we know that when we measure dollars leveraged, that doesn't necessarily correlate to development results achieved. And so as USAID thinks about this, we're focused on some qualitative learning questions because we believe that qualitative learning is really part of how we're going to get there, and that we need to further build the body of evidence in what works and what doesn't work in private sector engagement. It's not a question of should we engage the private sector. Instead, it's a question of how does it work best. So for us, those questions are how and to what extent does private sector engagement improve our development and humanitarian outcomes? And we're going to see different examples of that across different sectors. There's not one clean example of that. The second question is, what context-specific factors drive effective engagement with the private sector? And we know that there are things in context that make it work, and things that make it not work. And then the third question is, what private sector engagement relationship qualities influence results? And this is where I would speak to, I think, anecdotal experience that we have, but we haven't really dug in on a body of evidence to say that, look, we know we need to have aligned objectives. Sometimes our objectives are not exactly the same when we are partnering between a development organization and a company. They have a return on investment objective, we have a development objective. That's okay. But we need to each know what our objectives are, and we need to make sure our objectives are aligned and we're walking forward together. We also have really learned that that a relationship quality that is not a factor for success is when we have 50 different indicators that we want our private sector partners to report on. And guess what? Development indicators are not their core business. And so that is a recipe for lack of success, not success. So we have to make sure we are rigorous about focusing on development impact. And we also have to make sure that we are thoughtful about the core capabilities that each partner brings to the table and how we are asking things of each partner that align to their core capabilities. So we at USAID over the next year will spend some time thinking about how do we evolve and adapt our quantitative metrics in addition to these qualitative learning questions so that we do get beyond dollars leveraged, but so that we don't create such a burden of reporting that it's unrealistic and we get nowhere. So we hope that many of you will go on that journey with us.
So Sarah and Tara, as Sarah pointed out, at some level you guys work within a framework of maximizing shareholder value. And so how do you see these efforts fitting into that broader objective?
Well, so for us, we work in many emerging economies, and so having healthy communities around our stores and our clubs makes the most sense for us. And like I said, also, we're a big organization and we want to make sure we have sustainable value chains that support that organization. So paying attention to worker conditions, paying attention to the quality of products, water, soil, environment, all of those issues we take into consideration. I would say in the past, when we were starting this, we spent a lot of time on sort of outputs. We will train 1 million farmers. Yay. And we will buy $20 billion from women-owned businesses, which we did for the United States over 5 years. Those are great. They're wonderful because they incent behavior and they created different behaviors, and they made us change systems and processes in order to meet those development goals. And when you put a goal out of, I will train 1 million farmers, half of which will be women, you find out pretty quickly what the challenges are, and you work to address the challenges. So I do think there's a benefit in those numeric goals. The problem is, we got to a point which was that, and so what? You trained 1 million farmers, and so what? You bought $20 billion from women-owned businesses, and so what? And that's where we've started to think about a little bit more of those systems, and it's so much harder to think about systems change. But just give you an example. Instead of saying I'm going to train 1 million farmers, half of it would be women, we're saying I'd like to have 20 sustainable value chains for the core products that I buy. And it may be that gender is going to be a huge component. If you're working in cocoa, if you're working in certain value chains, you're going to have to work on gender. But we're not going to say it's got to be women farmers, because in a way, we've sort of prejudged the outcome by putting that hypothesis or that numerical challenge out there. We've sort of said training is the outcome versus economic development. So we're evolving in terms of our results framework. We always look at it from a shared value lens. But I do think if you're going to do any public-private partnership, you have to have aligned goals, an aligned sense of outcomes and outputs. And I would say, we sometimes can be frustrated when, one, the project is baked and then it comes. So the co-creation aspect it takes longer. It can be frustrating, but if you can co-create, you're going to get a better outcome. And then I would say, secondly, this idea that, another example we use is we partnered with USAID, I think it was El Salvador, where there was a great program that was training at-risk youth for employment. And our part of it was to say, we will pre-screen the applicants, and if they're good after the training, we'll hire them. But we never could scale it because everybody said, oh, but you didn't put any money in it. And that to us is frustrating because we're like, but we hired all of these at-risk youth
That's a huge
in a
investment.
really tricky area. And we gave our HR expertise to say, of all of these candidates, which might be the most appropriate to train. Because we've done a lot of pre-employment training and we actually have an expertise there. So, that's where I think we're trying to gently nudge a little bit towards to say, let's not focus so much on the philanthropy and let's focus a little bit more on the assets.
Tara, how do you think?
So it's, I would say, a very technical term I'm going to use. It's squishy for us. because we, we provide us sachets, and we can say that by 2050, I don't know, we've got a new goal. We want to provide more billions of liters of clean drinking water. So we can count the number of sachets that we've distributed, and we've enabled that many billions of clean drinking water to be delivered. And working with our partners, we get the data from them on how how clean water has improved their programming, how it has improved the compliance with the maternal child health programs, for example. But so in that circumstance, it's a little bit easier. But when we train women-owned businesses, for example, we've got a women-owned business program. It is squishy, right? Because our supply chain is very complicated. It takes, and not very many businesses can engage in a supply chain as complicated as ours. And so if we wanted to kind of increase the level of engagement of women-owned businesses, we had to change how we thought about what our end goal was going to be. And so it wasn't about, are we going to have these women-owned businesses in our supply chain? It's how can we enable more women-owned businesses to be better women-owned businesses, better businesses. So that's how we changed our goal and objective, and that's measured by listening to their feedback on what program we do, what are the results, how they've grown their businesses. So those are a little bit easier, but again, still kind of squishy. We just put it out there, and we hope that it's doing well. And I know that drives people crazy in this room, but for us, it's really about getting engaged, rolling up our sleeves, and providing what we can to further enable and help a particular development goal. It's not as high on our priority to have the measurement. If I were to talk to my marketing people, they want to look at, we do a piece of advertising, it's about media impressions, it's about social media engagement, those are very tangible numbers. We just take a different approach when we engage in the space. I think over time that will change, because I do think that there will be more opportunities to engage in places where Procter & Gamble can bring something unique to the table. One really good example is digitizing the last mile in India, for example. We've digitized the supply chain from our manufacturing facility to the storefront. And that was work that our folks engaged in over years in India. And when the Indian government was looking to digitize their payments to their citizens, we were asked to help bring some of that expertise to that space. So we won't be able to engage in every project, but where there are opportunities that we feel like we can bring something unique to the table, that's where we would like to engage. One idea that we engage in a lot of habit change. We're the company that convinces you need a Swiffer in your house, that you have to have those Tide Pods. So we've got a lot of expertise in understanding what consumers need, what they want, and how do you sell it to them? How do you market it to them? Why can't that be leveraged for hand washing? And that's another example of how we've engaged with behavior change. How do you engage and how do you communicate a behavior change that's going to improve a community? So it's different for us in swishy, very technical term, but I think that will get more regimented as we find new ways and new opportunities to engage with USAID and the State Department.
If I could just say one more thing, I think in some ways the private sector also has a higher tolerance for failure, in that it's our money, and if we screw up, we can actually say, wow, that went wrong, and it has in the past, and what did I learn from it, and what am I going to do better? And I do feel sometimes, and I get it, it's public money, and you want to have these great results because you want to be showing. But sometimes failure is actually the best thing you can do, because if we were doing it all right, we would have eradicated poverty by now. The second thing I'll say is the private sector can't do everything, and we're not a panacea. So I love this, but it's not the only answer, because we can't work in environments where there's no rule of law. We can't work in environments where you need a lot of normative change to actually create a development outcome. And there is a role for democracy building. There's a role for rule of law. There's a role for those assets that aren't normally thought of as private sector assets. And so I actually, I love it. I think it's great to rethink it, but I would hate to say it's the answer because you're going to be so disappointed. Like everybody's going to be like, the private sector was supposed to fix it and they didn't.
So we have a wall of failure at P&G's archive. So if you want to come and look at like that fit that you didn't want to spray on your vegetables to clean it, that's on the wall of failure. We've got lots of.
How you convince people to eat Tide Pods? Is
No, Sarah, don't say that. It's not intended use. Please don't eat Tide Pods. But that's also, again, something that, but you guys are doing more you're providing smaller grants where there's a higher tolerance for failure, right? So they're growing. So,
We're working on it.
Yeah, you guys are working on it.
This is absolutely an area that I think we as development professionals can learn from the private sector, where they fail fast, they learn from their failures, they do something different next time. We have not, I don't think, in the development and the public sector space, been as comfortable with claiming our failures, owning them, talking about them, and quickly learning from them. So one of the things we are trying to do at USAID is we published a new risk appetite statement last year. I know that sounds really sexy and exciting, but what it says is that our team should take smart risks. And we should be forward-leaning about taking smart risks where the benefit that we hope to achieve is worth that risk. And also that we should fail fast. And so one of the things we're doing there is making milestone-based awards, where there's a first milestone, and if we achieve the milestone, then it makes sense to move on to the next milestone. But if we don't achieve the milestone, then we shouldn't move on to continue with the program necessarily, or at least not as we originally planned. And so I think that's a way that we're evolving and learning from our colleagues in the private sector.
This is not how elected officials usually operate.
Stan, I'm sorry. Can I say one more thing? I'm sorry, you poor thing. Your panel's like gone amok.
Go ahead.
I wanted to piggyback.
About Tide Pods?
No, not about Tide Pods. That's going to get me fired. So one thing that Sarah talked about, the rule of law, and that's critically important because, one, we want to make sure that as a U.S.-based company, we have to engage in environments, and we can't engage in areas where the rule of law is not upheld. But USAID does some great work in that space as well, and P&G actually, we've got companies, 180-year history of engaging, and 100 years engaging around the world. And so we were actually working with you guys in, I'm going to say Myanmar, I think you guys have to say Burma, on how do you, in these emerging markets, how do you train government officials to behave ethically? Right? So again, another private sector expertise that for companies that have a history, that know how to engage in these spaces, it's training government officials to do the right thing. We know a little bit about that. We've been doing it for 180 years. And so we were actually helpful in providing the curriculum, doing some of the training on getting these governments in a space where they were safe environments for US-based businesses. So that's, just wanted to piggyback on that, but then the work that what the private sector can contribute to some of that work as well.
Thanks, Sarah. Let's take a few questions from the room. Please raise your hand if you have one. Any takers?
One in the front.
One right here. I think we're going to take 3 questions. So we're going to take one here, one over there, and one right here. Yeah.
And there's a microphone.
And there are mics strategically located very close to all people with questions. Please go ahead. Please introduce yourself. Questions usually end in a question mark.
Yes. I'll try. My name's Joan Duty-Gayoso from USAID State Peace Corps World Bank. Now I'm teaching at GW. This morning I was frustrated, and you all, I had a list. You've answered almost all the questions except one. The things I thought were lacking were a discussion of risk, which you just talked about, a discussion of capacity building, which I'd like to hear how you build in capacity to the kinds of things you're doing. A discussion of getting buy-in, which I think has been considered, and the alignment of goals. What I haven't heard yet is a talk about the different timeframes and time horizons that the private sector will have versus the public sector. You touched on the difference in accountability, and Sarah, and I was really glad to hear that. The only thing else I will say is over the years, I've heard about your packets So it's been kind of interesting to see how it evolved. I believe it started in corporate social responsibility for Procter & Gamble, and you've now moved it beyond that. That was a very interesting piece. So thank you. As a professor now, I can say the only question you haven't answered is the time frame.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And let's go over here for 2 more questions.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it's a quick question. I'm Yvette Neisser with DAI. I was just wondering if, Sarah Glass, if you could give a few examples of successful models of private sector investment from local companies in the countries where you're working. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Katie Honeyman from World Learning. Some of the examples you've given of your expertise might have been obvious to me, but there were at least 2 or 3 that would not have been obvious to me. So what would you advise us on how to get to know better different companies and what they can actually offer, especially because a lot of that internal expertise wouldn't be described publicly on the website, for example? Thank you.
All right, so let's take these 3 questions. So let's first talk about time horizons. How do you think of that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's obvious we're always going to hurry everybody up. We tend to think in 3 to 5 years time horizons in the private sector. Oftentimes when we have goals, they're maybe 5-year goals. You know, one of the innovations we had to do when we were trying to train 1 million farmers in 5 years was to kind of skip hop the normal procurement, aid procurement process, and go look and do a mapping, which is we loved. We loved the Feed the Future program because we felt like the data was more transparent on where the projects were. Like, one of the frustrating things is like, why don't we know where everybody's working? And why don't we have a map of what everybody's doing everywhere in the world? Because that would help us engage a lot better. So we actually hired, I think, one of your colleagues in the private sector to do a mapping of all of the farmer training programs so we could figure out where to engage. And so what we ended up doing was having to innovate, skip hop, and say, we'll fund XYZ, you're probably in the room, NGO that's doing an aid project, but may not be focused on gender, may be focused on a different crop. If we could keep the same type of framework and yet fund to do a crop that more women were participating in Bangladesh, in Rwanda, we could actually create a better life cycle for that program. We skipped the first few years of really startup cost. I hate to say it, you know, you go in, you've all been chief of party or whatever, you're gonna have 2 years of like not actually producing results. If we could come in at the arc of the program and extend the life and change it, we could actually get better results in terms of numbers trained, but also more money because we had this huge numeric goal. So some of it is being innovative about timing and thinking about alternative ways to get what you want getting done. I will answer just quickly the how you find out about us. We're pretty transparent, actually. We've had a global responsibility report for many years. We just published our first ESG report. In there, you see what we're trying to do and where we need help. And what we're focusing on from a development perspective, I think. And most companies will have either a CSR report or an ESG report. A lot of it's evolving. But I would study those first to say, boy, what are they focusing on? We're not soliciting grants anymore. So I know a lot of you afterwards, you're going to say, oh, I want to talk to one more person because I want to pitch you on. We're going to come to you. Because you're going to see where we're focused, and we'll do the solicitation now, which we find in many ways is more effective, but networking is super important, and I think there might be folks here from other nonprofits we've worked with because we've just known, hey, we have this new need on forced labor, can we work together? We know you do this, this, and this. So that's...
Yeah. I was just going to add, as it relates to talking about expertise within companies that you may or may not know is there. If you have current private sector partners, I would just ask, right? We've got this issue. Can you help us? Would you be willing to put one of your executives on loan from HR to help us with this particular problem or on this particular project? Often we're asked, one of our NGOs, for example, asked, could you bring one of your consumer market knowledge can we borrow one of your team members in order to help us with our donor engagement? Happy to do so. So it really depends on if you've got those relationships, just ask for if you have a specific need or if a project could benefit from that usage, but also see what companies do well. We're the world's largest advertiser. You're the world's largest grocer. We're the world's largest advertiser. We know a little bit about advertising, right? So if you're trying to get a marketing message out, then why not look to see what company is doing marketing really well and do that outreach? So I'm the outside of the box person, right? I'm the, think differently, but also, a closed mouth don't get fed, which is what my grandma used to say. So ask, network, and if you've got a need, think about who in the private sector can help me with this and reach out. And oftentimes it won't be companies like ours, right? There may be smaller companies that have an expertise that might benefit. And would be
tech companies.
Tech companies as well that might be willing to engage as a part of their doing good while driving growth.
Sarah, do you want to give a couple of examples of engagement with local companies?
I do. You heard both Tara and Sarah talk about relationships. And I think that it's important to say that none of this happens overnight. We all talked about this idea that in order to have effective private sector engagement, one of the things that's valuable is that when we come together, we better understand whatever the problem is that we were individually trying to tackle because we have a fuller picture. But we actually can't figure out how to work together usually in that first meeting, right? That it is building that relationship, understanding the value proposition that different partners can bring to the table is something that happens over time. And so there's this perception that the U.S. government is slow. That's real. The U.S. government is slow.
As is P&G, as is Walmart. Everybody, big organizations are slow.
That's what I was going to say. Sometimes it's actually in a partnership with a big company. It's not actually the U.S. government that's holding things up. Sometimes these big companies, we're all slow, and part of that is so that we make sure we're getting it right.
Correct.
And we're building a trusted relationship over time. That is also true in working with local companies. And so I would say that the really important place to start is in mapping the development or humanitarian issue that you're trying to solve against a private sector lens. What capabilities do you most need to solve this problem, and what private sector industries have these capabilities, right? Or what private sector industries bring something in a value chain or a supply chain to solving this problem? And then in your locality, who are the actors, who are the private sector companies, local and global, that bring this to the table? So what we've seen locally, I'll just give two quick examples. In the agriculture space, you heard Sarah say they're the biggest grocer in the world. They need to buy local produce from local farmers because it's cheaper than to ship it in through customs, et cetera. We have seen real value in working with local food processing companies, right, where you want to not just sell whole produce, but process it into various different products that can be sold locally. And that's a place where I've seen great work be done with local food processing companies where organizations like Walmart or P&G will be off-takers and agree to buy X amount from those local companies, so you're creating that broader value chain. In the health space, the pharmacy industry is an industry, right? And so even when you think about health as a public good, very often you have to get your medical prescriptions and products from somewhere that you go and buy those things. And so we have worked to help build the pharmacy industry that are often local players in the countries in which we work with. So those are just two examples. There are a whole wealth more. And I think it's important that you think about it from the specific sort of sector and development issue that you're trying to tackle, and then what are the adjacent industries that you're working with there.
Thank you, Sarah. Do we have permission for one last question? Quick one. I know that a good number of our audience members are students or relatively young professionals. Could all three of you give them a quick line of advice on how to build their careers?
Boy, I think it's sort of interesting in that for our corporate responsibility sustainability program, think about getting out of Washington, because most of the jobs are actually at headquarters. So if you like Bentonville, Arkansas, yay. It's
Great community.
It actually is lovely. It's lovely. And it's actually very pretty there. But that's actually where a lot of the jobs are going to be. They're going to be headquarter-based jobs. They're not going to be DC-based jobs. That being said, a lot of folks start here either at an NGO, in the government, on the Hill to get some expertise. We rarely hire people directly out of college. We do hire people through MBA internship programs, et cetera. But we tend to hire for relationships, for knowledge, and for expertise. And so get your expertise, then find a niche. Our jobs are generally published on a website. You know, it sounds hard, but it's not. We do a lot of recruiting for Bentonville, Arkansas. But that would be my in this particular niche in the field. I think the good news is the type of job that you can do to bring a development mindset to the private sector is changing. You know, there are people who work for me now who focus on supply chain and government relations, who are tackling gnarly issues, but with a real development mindset and working with NGOs and stakeholders. That's a job that probably didn't exist. I know it didn't exist because we didn't have it 5 years ago. So there are also different types of jobs than there were before.
I would say, so if you don't get your dream job and you have to do something that's not your dream job, find a way to continue within the work, either in a volunteer basis in your private time that brought you here today. So even if you can't do it full time, find a way to continue to do it, because I think that you'll find your way back to it. Also, it keeps your networking skills and your network active. So if you don't land that dream job doing CSR for Walmart in Bentonville, Arkansas, then get a good job, and then find a way to continue on to help and continue to improve the world. And I don't do this full time. I'm a lobbyist, so generally speaking. So this is my path is a little different, but I enjoy it. I believe in it. I believe in what the private sector can do good for the world. So that's what that would be my piece of advice.
And I have two pieces of advice for anybody who is passionate about global development. And the first is
Apply to USAID.
Yes, it's exciting to go work in Bentonville, Arkansas, but also go work in the field. Go work in Kenya and Uganda and Colombia, and, right? Go get that international experience, learn the language. There's just no substitute for being on the ground, working in the field, tackling these issues. And then my second piece of advice is that the future development professional, the skills and the capabilities you need are different than they have been in the last 20 years. The future development professional is multidisciplinary, I believe really strongly, and that this set of skills, right, you might be a public health professional who also has expertise in public health finance. And so I would just say that this set of skills in business, finance, supply chain is core to the skills of the future development professional in combination with the disciplines that have been important in development, in democracy, rights, and governance, in health, in agriculture, et cetera, for decades. And so that's a way that the development sector is evolving. And so embrace those opportunities to learn and build those skills.
You include technology in that, right?
I would very much include technology in that skill set, absolutely.
Excellent. Well, on that note, thank you all very much. Please, a round of applause for our panelists.